In this episode, I wanted to tackle the headline-making story that shook me and so many women last week. Abortion rights are under attack with states like Georgia, Kentucky, Missouri, Mississippi, and Ohio passing legislation that bans abortion after a fetal heartbeat is detected, as early as 6 weeks. And Alabama took it a step further by making it illegal to perform an abortion, a crime punishable with up to 99 years in prison. If you're thinking that all this seems sudden and unexpected, you're not alone. And if you're wondering how these states can pass legislation that is in direct defiance to the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, it turns out that this is all part of a bigger plan. I brought back to the podcast my friend Erin Hager to talk about these recent bills and how this could impact women, mothers, and the U.S. as a whole. Erin worked for Planned Parenthood on the public policy side of the organization in Missouri and also writes about reproductive rights. So as I watched these bills being voted on, I knew I needed to get Erin on the line to get her viewpoint. This topic is more nuanced than I even initially understood, and we'll dive into the history of abortion in politics, the Roe v. Wade decision, and what the future holds. Welcome to the This Is Parenting podcast, a show devoted to sharing the roller coaster journey of parenthood from moms and dads all over the world. I'm your host, Andrea Rhodes. Information and show notes about today's episode can be found at thisisparentingpodcast.com. Let's get started.
I worked for Planned Parenthood from 2013 to 2016 as a grassroots organizer. And I worked at the affiliate that is located here in the Kansas City area. So at the time, we worked in just Kansas and Missouri, that particular affiliate did. But I think now that affiliate has expanded to cover a couple other states in the Midwest. And as a grassroots organizer, I worked on like the public policy side of the organization. I helped recruit volunteers. I helped organize events, protests, took volunteers to the Capitol to talk with legislators and stuff like that. So I wasn't on the healthcare side. I worked with some healthcare folks, but my work was mostly on the policy side. In the two states we worked in, so Kansas and Missouri, we were just doing a lot of defensive work. You know, some other states with more friendly legislatures could focus on more proactive agendas, lobbying legislators to pass laws that expanded access to reproductive health care. But in the states I worked in, it was a lot of just trying to keep bad laws from passing. So there were a lot of laws directed at comprehensive sex education in schools. So we would sometimes bring teens to the Capitol to talk with legislators about the importance of sex education. And then I was also there when Missouri passed their 72-hour waiting period to receive abortion services. You know, in those experiences, the things that stand out the most, there were a lot of young people, a lot of millennials that were involved as volunteers, a lot of high school students. So that was always really encouraging to see. But the stories that stuck with me the most were stories from older women who were either had stories from before abortion was legal or knew people who experienced that time. And I just really think a lot of the reality of what that looks like is lost in today's debate because people my age and younger don't have an understanding of how dangerous and scary that was. So hearing stories from these women who had experienced that or whose family members had experienced that is something that will always stick with me. And we always tried to, lift up their voices when we were speaking with legislators.
And that goes to the point that's been starting to kind of come across in this conversation now, where even if you ban abortion, abortions are going to happen. Was that the type of things that you were hearing from those who came before us, before Roe v. Wade went through?
Yeah, I mean, people who had friends and family lose their lives to unsafe abortions or whose lives and health were drastically altered. And I also think, while we're talking about that it's important to point out that in a lot of states right now, Missouri stands out in particular, where there is one abortion clinic that is unfortunately the reality again for a lot of women, especially low income women, women of color, single mothers, because when you have to travel so far to obtain an abortion, when you're in a state like Missouri with a 72-hour waiting period, when you are burdened with restrictions and regulations, it isn't an option that is readily available to you like it is to women with better means, quite frankly.
What Aaron is talking about here is that many states in the U.S., while technically abiding by the law of allowing abortions, have put such severe restrictions and red tape around the clinics who provide services to women that it makes it incredibly difficult for some to actually get an abortion. The Supreme Court case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992 was the conservatives' best shot up to that point of overturning Roe. The court upheld the legality of abortion, but put a caveat that said states can regulate up to viability as long as they do not place an undue burden on women in doing so. This basically gave states an opening to be legally creative in how to regulate abortions. One example of how states do this is by holding clinics to a higher standard from a building perspective. They will require clinics to have special doorways, hallways, etc., to be more like a hospital than a clinic. They may require that a doctor who works at the clinic also have privileges at a local hospital. Kansas requires a yearly inspection by the health department, where the clinics are scrutinized with strict regulations. Complying with all this red tape makes it really difficult to keep a clinic open, and many have shut down because of it, leaving some states with only one available for women to utilize, one, in the entire state. Another example is in South Dakota, where they require a woman who is seeking an abortion to go to a crisis pregnancy center first, where she will be inundated with anti-choice literature and discussion. In Texas, doctors who perform abortions must recite a script that, according to Texas lawmakers, gives a woman all the necessary info she needs before ending a life, including adoption options and development stages of the fetus. They must also perform a medically unnecessary sonogram and make patients listen to the fetal heartbeat, and then they must send their patient home to wait a required 24 hours.
Right now we are seeing these legislatures advance policies that will very much affect everyone and have the potential to bring us right back to those dark times before abortion was legal. But for so many women in states without a lot of access to reproductive health care, this is already a reality.
I think we've been, dare I say, spoiled from a mainstream perspective where we felt protected in general, right? We kind of, I don't want to say fell asleep at the wheel, but we felt like this had been decided. This is where it's at. And your experience with Planned Parenthood is you kind of saw that there has always been a fight going. It just wasn't mainstream until as of late. So it's important that we continue to keep our guard up and we continue to fight, and we cannot dismiss any of this as something that will just go away or that will be struck down in court, because I am a little worried that some people are on their heels a bit with this news where, yes, it's shocking and it's frustrating, but don't worry, someone will sue, and we can't be so sure about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to understand a little bit of the history and framework about how we got here, because this wasn't just like something, overnight that some folks in Alabama and Georgia and Missouri just decided, hey, we're going to go all in on restricting access to abortion.
In 1973, when Roe v. Wade was going through the courts, it was not a highly contested topic like it is today. There were certainly some Catholic groups that were opposed to abortion, but the debate never hit mainstream. There wasn't an organized anti-abortion movement at the time. Instead, it was something that happened slowly as a group of conservatives figured out that the topic of abortion was a good way to try and get more evangelicals into the electorate. They were able to convince Ronald Reagan to take this issue on, and by the 80s, the topic of abortion was a huge political issue. Conservatives feel that Roe v. Wade doesn't really hold water from a legal perspective. The way the Supreme Court ruled in that case was based more on a constitutional right to privacy and not equality or equal rights. Conservatives have interpreted the Constitution to not have an explicit and direct right to privacy spelled out, and feels there's an opening for the case to be overturned. And they feel it can be done with a court case challenging that decision. So you might be asking yourself, why a sudden push for legislation that bans abortion? If conservatives have been systematically regulating the abortion procedure process and seemingly winning as clinic after clinic closes, why take such a giant leap forward with more aggressive legislation? Well, that comes down to the current makeup of the Supreme Court justices. Conservative Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh have been recently added to the bench, which many experts feel may have tipped the scale in favor of Roe being overturned, or at the least, the Supreme Court agreeing to review a case that challenges Roe. That's where all these new heartbeat bills come in. Legislators in these states know that these bills are in direct violation of Roe and that pro life organizations will sue to block these laws from ever taking effect, which starts the process of having these bills reviewed in the lower state courts with the goal eventually appealing all the way up to the Supreme Court. Conservatives feel that if they can get the Supreme Court to review one of their bills, that they have a shot of overturning Roe based on the current makeup of the Supreme Court justices.
I also think another part of that really needs to be lifted up is the way that the anti-choice movement has also successfully chipped away at the language around this issue. And a lot of people who do support abortion rights are kind of quiet and apologetic about it, who kind of, acknowledge this is a complicated issue. There are a lot of moral viewpoints. And a lot of that is a direct result of the anti-choice movement making this a matter of religion, of so many other issues besides like bodily autonomy. And so even, Democrats and folks that may have a somewhat supportive voting record on these issues, without vocal and unapologetic support for a woman's right to choose, we are just allowing the anti-choice movement to gain more ground. So a combination of just this long-term game that these folks have been playing for a long time and the reluctance of people who actually support this issue to speak up about it, I think have really culminated to this point where we are really looking at a possible future where this is not an accessible option.
That's very interesting. So what do you think is happening next? Now that Alabama is kind of in the front here with legislation that is basically anti-abortion, do you feel that other states are still going to follow, or is that the one most solid case that they needed to get out there so that someone will sue and it'll end up in the Supreme Court to challenge Roe?
I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see this pop up in many states, all with, the hope that one of them will get to the Supreme Court. And conversely, states that do value a woman's right to choose, you're seeing some of them pass other legislation aimed at enshrining it as a right in law. So I think everyone who cares about this issue one way or another is working towards what they need to do should the courts overturn this, and to kind of set up the kind of access to care they'd like to see in their states.
And how would you suggest that somebody actually takes an active role in making sure this legislation does not actually see the light of day? It seems like such a big thing to overcome. And where does one little person fit into this massive discussion? Sometimes it feels like there's nothing we can do but talk, and talk isn't going to be enough. So do you have suggestions on how listeners can become more active and make a dent in this discussion?
A few different things. First of all, if you do live in any of these states where this legislation is being debated, be vocal with your legislators. I know particularly those of us in the millennial generation loathe phone calls. I am with you, but they are one of the few things that are actually really effective. So reaching out to your local politicians and being vocal about how much you care about this issue is one way to get involved. On that note, elections matter and judicial appointments matter. So paying attention to some of the folks that are being nominated to serve in these judicial capacities that are going to be deciding whether or not these laws are constitutional is another way that you can just be involved and make a difference. And then donating to organizations on the ground in the South, donating directly to those organizations that are doing the grassroots organizing, that are putting pressure on folks, is another really important way to fight back. And I mean, also, I'll just say again and reiterate how important I think it is for us to really win this issue. We have to really be unapologetically in support of abortion rights access. And I think that means there are some people that engaging on this issue on is going to be a waste of time and energy. But if there are folks that are kind of in this muddled middle that feel conflicted about this issue, that support a woman's right to access, but are not necessarily going to show up in a protest about it, those are the people that we really need to be having these discussions with, because it is going to take all of us in the streets, knocking down legislators' doors to make a difference. I do think that difference can be made by having conversations, sometimes difficult ones, with especially middle-class white women who are maybe for the first time seeing that this could be a reality for them, because like I said, it's already a reality for a lot of other folks. And those of us that find ourselves conflicted on the issue need to not be conflicted anymore. We need to be vocal and stand up about it.
I will link some different types of funds and services that you can go and donate to. The Yellowhammer Fund, the funds from that go to Alabama, which it's obviously getting a lot of press at the moment. You know, you raised such a good point, and we kind of mentioned it before, but I live in a state in Illinois where we are very much pro right to choose. I had no idea that other states, even directly south of me in Missouri, only have one clinic. I just did not realize how few and far between these clinics are that actually help women who need this kind of help. It's impossible for them to get to, like you mentioned earlier, that the travel alone, people can't take off of work to get this done and make the arrangements to get there. And so beyond the conversation that we're having now about the legislation around whether or not abortion is going to be legal, when we win this fight and abortion continues to be legal, we have a bigger fight on our hands that entails getting the proper access to this type of healthcare in the hands of all women that need it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right.
I guess I will say I am maybe a little bit hopeful in the sense that this conversation will lead to broader change in the future. And if more people are aware of the actual scope of this problem, then we will be able to attack it better. I actually want to also get your perspective as a mom about all of this. And now you have 2 young children. I also have 2 young kids. I have a boy and a girl. And so I am in this bit of an odd situation where I have never been more fearful for my daughter's future and what she is going to grow up to know about women's rights and about reproductive rights and just about herself as a female in this society and her role in it and where her status can be. And then on the flip side, I have a son where I am very eager to teach him better and to teach him the values that should be instilled in all males who that clearly are not at the moment about women's rights. I want my son to be better than what we are seeing from the generally white males who are making these decisions for females who will be impacted for years to come.
Yeah, it's interesting to ponder all that as a parent because there are so many kind of layers there about how to raise children, particularly white boys, because there is an opportunity there to raise children that become men who recognize their privilege and use it for good. And that is something like I'm continually thinking about and trying to remember, while at the same time, I'm just trying to get him, who is 3.5, to just like go pee and poop in the potty, but also to just like have these open conversations about these differences that we see in society and an understanding that this myth that we all have the same access and the same opportunities is not true, and that there may be doors that open for him that don't for my daughter or don't for his friends or don't for people of color, and there are reasons for that. And it's really his job to be part of the difference there. And I also just hope in general, when it comes to just like reproductive rights in general and parenting, that I raise both of them to understand just how hard parenting is. I grew up, and I think a lot of women grew up, whether consciously or subconsciously, with this understanding that they'll be mom someday or that they should be mom someday. And I think our generation is definitely becoming better about being open about what that means, how difficult that is, especially without community supports, how prevalent mental illness is among new moms. And I just think if I had a little bit more of the openness of that conversation, I wouldn't have gone into it so blindly. And I really want my kids to really evaluate if it is for them and know that if it's not, it doesn't have to be for them. And there's no shame in that. And I think hopefully, with that being the foundation, that they both understand how crucial being able to choose whether or not you're going to be pregnant is, and how important it is for you choose to have them, that you are, ready and able and committed to parent. So, they're small right now. My daughter's like not even 3 months old. So it's not like we're having long conversations, but openness, communication, and a willingness to acknowledge the privilege that, each of them have and the privileges they don't have, hopefully can go a long way to them being part of a generation that protects this kind of access.
It's just astonishing. I just didn't anticipate having to tackle this particular issue with my kids. I naively thought, like probably many have, that this was something we have conquered already, and we have agreed as a nation that this was important.
Yeah, I guess me growing up in Kansas, I feel like these rights have kind of always been under attack. I've always kind of seen them at the forefront, just with where I grew up. Protests around this issue from anti-choicers were things, I saw regularly. And of course, there's a lot of the beginnings of the religious right movement kind of started in that area, and a lot of anti-abortion movements started there. So I can't say I really fleshed out thoroughly how I would talk to my future kids about it, but knowing that it's something that has always been controversial, that politicians have tried to restrict, something that I've just kind of been familiar with. And it is one of the reasons why I went and wanted to work for Planned Parenthood, because I knew that it was an issue that needed attention. I have friends in other states, a friend in New Hampshire that is just I cannot believe the stuff you deal with there. So it really, depends on where you're at and what you've seen. And, your experience in Illinois is going to be different. Interesting to think about all of that and how we address this with children.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've definitely had to kind of check myself on this topic because of the state that I live in, and I haven't seen it like you have and others have in other states. I used Planned Parenthood services when I was young, and I had a sense, and I was a little bit nervous maybe walking into the clinic my first time, because I just knew in general that maybe there would be protesters there, and there never were. I went there for years, and never once was there a protest. Never once was there somebody outside the door giving me grief or asking me if I was going in to get an abortion or why I was there. And I never had to deal with it. And it was generally a pleasant experience. So that right there kind of showed me naively that this isn't as big of a problem as I thought it was. And the other thing that I keep pondering, and I don't know if you've had even a second to kind of go through this rabbit hole that I've been through, is kind of doing this domino effect of, if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, I am just thinking about all the dominoes this happens, where you take just one female who comes and needs those services and is turned down, and what that effect has on her life, the life of that child, the life of the people around her. And she maybe is no longer able to get an education. She's no longer able to hold a job. Her kid is not wanted and suffers because of that. And she's not able to be the mom that she could have been had she had the education and gone on to a future path that she had envisioned for herself, and had a kid when she was ready. And I'm thinking that times thousands, and that story times thousands, and how that actually could change our society. And it is frightening.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on that. That is a reality that so many people have difficulty discussing. What are the real world implications of unwanted pregnancies, unwanted births to women who otherwise weren't ready, don't have the family support, don't have the financial means. I have heard people in the anti-choice movement, talk about how important and sacred every life is, and that, any life is better than no life. And this kind of is getting into some wonky territory, but I personally think that lives should be good. Children should be cared for, provided for, fed, educated. And any parent who is maybe trying to decide if that is something that they can offer a child right now is making the best decision for their circumstance and is choosing what maybe to be a parent later on in life, maybe to not be a parent at all. Maybe this person already has children and they won't be able to provide for the children they have if they bring another child into their family. 56%, I believe, maybe check with the Guttmacher Institute, but I know at least half of the women that receive abortions in this country are already mothers. So we aren't necessarily talking about like irresponsible teens or, whatever other narratives the anti-choice movement has made up about women who receive abortions. We are talking about people who, for whatever reason, has decided this isn't right for them right now. And it's really time we talk about the realities of what it looks like when people are forced to have children against their will. I've shared, my personal story with you both behind the scenes and on your podcast about, my journey with postpartum depression and anxiety as someone who very much chose to be a mom and wanted to be a mom and who had access to health insurance and medical care and a partner and family support. And I almost fell through the cracks. And undiagnosed and untreated mental illness has lifelong effects for not just the mom, but the children too. So we really do need to think about what a world looks like where women don't have agency over their bodies and don't get to choose and control when or if they have families, because I don't actually think it's a world that any of us would really want to live in.
Yeah, and you bring such a good point, because a lot of the stories that are starting to come out, there's a great Twitter hashtag, you know me, and the stories that are coming through on that hashtag are very eye-opening, because you're right, they do not fit that cliche that the anti-right side is trying to throw out there, that it's a 14-year-old that got in trouble. It's not that. There are so many stories of women who are well off, who are well established in their career and do not want another child right at that moment, and how that would derail them for a variety of reasons. And the reasons don't fucking matter. It's their reasons. And they chose to abort the pregnancy because that was what was in their best interest for their lives and their family. And so I love, if you have a chance to go and check out that thread, it was a really, really great illustration of who is actually utilizing these services and who is actually in need of this healthcare.
Yeah, that is a great point. 1 in 4 women have an abortion at some time in their lifetime. I think that's a stat that people just need to sit with for a minute, because that is a lot.
That stat means that somebody that has had an abortion. No one wants to say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the issue is so stigmatized that, people don't even feel like they can share with, their personal circles that they have terminated a pregnancy, they've had an abortion. But 1 in 4 women means that exactly like you said, somebody somebody you love. We don't like to talk about it, but it is common. It is normal, and it has been happening since women could get pregnant. The difference between its legality is the difference in how many women die and how many people are hurt in the process of trying to end an unwanted pregnancy, and whether it is safe and regulated. And that's really the only difference. Banning it isn't going to stop it.
You're talking about these things that you can't see them up front, but you're talking about women who, like you said, are going to need more care postpartum because of what they have just gone through and what they will continue going through emotionally, mentally, physically after becoming a mom in a fashion that they never wanted to begin with. Those are all healthcare costs that we are not considering whenever we're talking about this decision. It's going to impact so many intangibles, and I don't hear enough of that, of kind of figuring out that puzzle of, if this, then that. What does that picture actually look like if women are not allowed to choose?
Right, exactly. And to see these policies in a time when our maternal mortality rate is rising, I think it is the worst of any developed country. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Forced to have children could have a higher chance of dying in childbirth than 50 years ago. I mean, it's just unfathomable. I don't even know if I feel optimistic or pessimistic about what, if it gets to the Supreme Court, what will ultimately be decided. Really can't say what will happen. It's, you know, on one hand, I want to naively believe that there's no way these years of precedent are going to just all be overturned, but it really is a scary reality. And I think with such a possibly drastic outcome, we need to prepare ourselves to take drastic measures.
I want to end the episode with a big thanks to Erin for jumping on so last minute to chat with me about this important topic. But I also want to send you off with a call to action. Take action. Call your legislators, voice your concerns, donate to organizations that are on the ground doing the hard work day in and day out. I'll link all of these in the show notes, but here are a few. Access Reproductive Care Southeast helps families in 12 states in the Southeast access reproductive care. National Network of Abortion Funds is a network of 80 funds in at least 38 states that seeks to eliminate economic barriers for low-income individuals seeking an abortion. The Yellowhammer Fund is based in Alabama that helps fund abortions as well as cover the cost to travel to their 3 clinics. Women Have Options is an Ohio-based organization providing financial assistance and support to low-income patients seeking reproductive care, abortions included. You can sign up for alerts through Planned Parenthood to stay up to speed on the latest reproductive rights legislation in your area, as well as protests and who to contact. And finally, I challenge you all to have this conversation with someone you know. Talk to them about the recent legislation and share with them why this topic is so important and the lives that are at stake should Roe be overturned. Awareness is key, but action is necessary.